January 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The morning frost clings to the barbed wire, glittering under a pale sun. Steam rises from tin mugs of coffee as American guards walk their rounds, boots crunching over snow. Across the yard, a group of Japanese prisoners stand quietly in formation. Or at least, they try to. Old instincts make them line up, rigid and disciplined, eyes forward, waiting for orders that never come. A guard waves them toward the mess hall. "Breakfast?" he says simply. One man hesitates, confused. No shouting, no striking, no barking of commands. Inside, the smell of warm bread and eggs fills the air. A prisoner sits slowly, unsure if he's allowed. The guard just nods. For the first time in months, some of them feel something strange. Not fear, not obedience. Freedom. Their minds struggle to accept it. For men raised under imperial rule, this was unthinkable. Before these men ever stood behind barbed wire in America, they were soldiers of an empire that worshipped discipline above all else. In Imperial Japan, surrender was not merely shameful, it was unforgivable. From the earliest days of training, recruits were taught that capture was worse than death. The Bushido Code, the ancient warrior ethos, demanded complete loyalty to the emperor, obedience without question, and sacrifice without hesitation. By 1941, Japan's military machine was unmatched in fanaticism. On the battlefields of the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, Japanese soldiers fought to the last man. They charged into machine gun fire rather than raise a white flag. When captured, it was often because they were too wounded to continue. Many of them expected execution, believing Allied forces to be merciless. After all, Japanese propaganda told them so. Americans were barbarians, devoid of honor, who tortured prisoners for sport. But the Pacific War shattered illusions on both sides. As Japan expanded its empire across Southeast Asia, reports of brutal treatment of Allied POWs, starvation, forced labor, and executions became public knowledge in the West. The infamous Bataan Death March in 1942 cemented the image of Japanese cruelty. Allied soldiers who survived described unbearable horror. Meanwhile, far from the front lines, a different kind of experiment was taking shape in the United States. When the first groups of Japanese prisoners began arriving after 1942, American officials faced a question. How should they be treated? Revenge was tempting. Hatred was everywhere. But the U.S. War Department, under the Geneva Convention of 1929, made a decision rooted not in vengeance, but in principle. Japanese POWs would be treated humanely. They would receive food, shelter, medical care, and even education. To the American mind, this was both moral and strategic. Humane treatment could break the ideological wall of imperial fanaticism, showing Japan's soldiers what democracy and dignity looked like. Yet, for the men arriving from the jungles of the Pacific, this new world felt unreal. After months of starvation, beatings, and terror, they stepped into camps where guards smiled, mail was delivered, and meals were regular. Some even thought it was a trick, a prelude to execution. Others couldn't bear the shame of survival. But over time, disbelief began to soften into curiosity. They started to see that this strange freedom, this gentleness, was not a deception, but a deliberate act, and it was only the beginning of their transformation. Inside the wire, the rhythm of life soon became something no Japanese soldier could have imagined. At American camps, such as Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Clinton in Mississippi, and Camp Fort Ord in California, the routine followed an orderly, yet astonishingly humane, structure. Prisoners woke at dawn, ate full breakfasts, and spent their days working, studying, or simply resting. Food was plentiful, sometimes more than American civilians at home could afford during rationing. There was rice, vegetables, and meat, prepared according to Japanese tastes whenever possible. Some camps even employed Japanese cooks among the prisoners, giving them a sense of purpose. Clothing was clean. Medical treatment was immediate. To many POWs, it felt surreal. One former soldier later recalled that he ate better as a prisoner than as an imperial soldier. But what shocked them most wasn't the food. It was the freedom. They were allowed to walk within the camp's open grounds, talk to guards, play baseball, even form music groups. American officers encouraged education programs, English lessons, mathematics, agriculture, and democratic philosophy. Books that had been banned in Japan were suddenly available in the camp library. For men who had been taught only obedience, this exposure to free thought was disorienting and liberating. There were cultural exchanges too. American guards often found themselves fascinated by Japanese customs, and in turn, POWs learned about American life. Some camps screened movies. Others held small exhibitions of Japanese art. Over time, the hostility began to dissolve into something resembling mutual respect. Behind this kindness, however, was calculation. The U.S. government saw psychological value in humane treatment. Breaking the myth of the cruel enemy could weaken Japan's morale. Letters written by POWs, carefully monitored but often sincere, were allowed to reach Japan through neutral channels. These letters spoke of fair treatment, good food, and respectful guards. To imperial authorities, this was dangerous propaganda. They suppressed such messages, fearing they would erode the warrior spirit of their troops. Meanwhile, American intelligence officers quietly interviewed POWs, gathering valuable information about Japanese tactics, morale, and training. Cooperation often came not through coercion, but trust, something unthinkable in the culture of fear that had defined the Japanese military. As the war dragged on, the camps became microcosms of two worlds, one built on rigid discipline, the other on freedom. Inside these fences, Japanese soldiers experienced democracy for the first time, not through lectures or politics, but through simple acts of humanity. And as this strange new reality unfolded, it began to reveal the deeper contrasts that would define their emotional, psychological, and moral awakening. For many Japanese soldiers, capture was the end of everything they believed in. From childhood, they had been told that surrender erased honor, that a man who lived as a prisoner no longer had a soul. Inside the American camps, that belief began to fracture. At first, they refused to smile, avoided eye contact, and performed silent rituals of shame. Some even tried to commit suicide rather than eat American food. But time softened them. The guards treated them with dignity, sometimes even friendship. Letters from home were delivered. Small parcels from the Red Cross arrived. Men who had expected cruelty were given books, sports equipment, and newspapers. They began to laugh again, quietly at first, as though afraid of being heard. Some built small gardens. Others taught each other songs from home. The human transformation was slow, but profound. For the first time, many realized that compassion could exist outside imperial control, that freedom didn't mean chaos, and kindness wasn't weakness. It was a revelation that would haunt and heal them for decades. The tactical angle behind every handshake, every warm meal, and every clean bed lay a strategy. American military intelligence understood the power of perception. If Japanese soldiers could see that the enemy was not a monster, the myth of imperial superiority would begin to crumble. The War Department authorized re-education programs within certain camps. These were not brainwashing efforts, but subtle cultural introductions. POWs were shown films about democracy, freedom of speech, and ordinary American life. Families in peaceful towns, schools, workers, and farmers. It was a deliberate contrast to the propaganda-fed vision of a decaying, corrupt West. The approach worked. Reports from camp officers noted that morale among POWs improved dramatically. Cooperation increased. Prisoners began volunteering information, not out of fear, but out of genuine curiosity about the American system. Intelligence officers soon realized that kindness was more effective than interrogation. By mid-1944, the American humane experiment had quietly become one of the most successful psychological strategies of the war. A silent battle of ideas fought not with weapons, but with respect. And within that calm war of minds, other angles began to emerge: technological, moral, and deeply personal. 3. The technological and organizational angle-running POW camps for thousands of enemy soldiers across a continent required remarkable organization. The United States Army operated more than 50 main camps and 500 branch camps, spread from California to New York. Each was a small, self-contained world: wired fences, wooden barracks, watchtowers, canteens, and work areas, built with precision and discipline, yet designed to maintain dignity. Every camp followed a structured daily schedule: morning roll call, work assignments, mealtime, recreation, and evening rest. But unlike imperial camps, where order was enforced through fear, the Americans used trust. Japanese prisoners were given responsibilities: kitchen duty, medical assistance, even administrative roles. They managed their own internal councils and solved disputes through discussion rather than punishment. Communication systems were advanced for their time. Mail services operated through neutral countries like Switzerland, allowing POWs to write home. Censors reviewed letters, but the content that reached Japan often shocked censors. Messages describing good food, clean beds, and respect from American soldiers. Work programs were another strategic success. POWs helped with agricultural production, construction, and maintenance, not as slaves, but as paid workers under Geneva Convention regulations. The wages were small, yet symbolic. It reminded them they were still human beings with agency, not broken captives. In this disciplined yet free environment, technology and humanity merged, creating a paradox that would forever contrast with the iron grip of imperial discipline. The leadership and moral angle. At the heart of the system were American officers who made ethical choices under immense pressure. Many had lost comrades in the Pacific. Some had witnessed Japanese atrocities firsthand, yet they followed orders to treat prisoners fairly. Colonel George S. Clark, who oversaw POW operations at Camp McCoy, once remarked that discipline without dignity breeds monsters. His approach was firm but humane, insisting that moral strength was a weapon more powerful than revenge on the other side. Japanese camp leaders and guards, conditioned by decades of imperial ideology, couldn't understand this restraint. To them, showing mercy was weakness. In Japan's military, power meant dominance, and submission was total. The contrast between these two leadership styles, authoritarian versus ethical, shaped every interaction between captor and captive. Over time, Japanese prisoners began to notice something profound. Their American guards seemed freer than any officer they had ever served. Orders were followed, yes, but with reason, not fear. That realization planted a seed that would later blossom into doubt about everything they'd been taught about loyalty and honor. The enemy's view. Through Japan's eyes back in Tokyo, the Japanese government did everything it could to silence reports of humane treatment, to admit that their soldiers were alive and safe, even comfortable, in enemy hands would destroy the narrative of martyrdom. The Ministry of War strictly censored all mail and dismissed Allied broadcasts about POW welfare as lies. Yet whispers spread. Families received vague letters, coded with kindness. Soldiers at the front heard rumors that captured comrades were living like guests. Many refused to believe it. Some grew confused, even demoralized. How could the enemy, the so-called Devil America, be merciful while their own empire punished weakness so brutally? For a nation built on rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience, this contradiction was intolerable. But it also revealed something crucial. Even during total war, humanity could become a weapon of truth. As 1945 approached, the walls of ideology were beginning to crack, and inside those quiet camps, a transformation was reaching its turning point. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned. Japan's empire was collapsing under relentless Allied bombardment. Cities like Tokyo and Osaka burned nightly under waves of incendiary bombs. Out in the Pacific, entire garrisons were wiped out. But in the quiet corners of America, the war seemed distant. Behind the fences of Camp McCoy, Camp Kennedy, and others like them, the Japanese prisoners lived in a strange pocket of peace. Something profound began to happen there. The men who had once shouted "Tenno Heika Banzai," detoured, "Long live the Emperor," before suicidal charges were now learning English phrases like "good morning" and "thank you." They attended voluntary classes, discussed democracy with camp officers, and read books on American history. A few even joined re-education programs designed to prepare them for life after the war. Programs that introduced them to freedom of speech, individual rights, and the idea that loyalty could exist without tyranny. For the first time, many began to question what they had fought for. Was the empire truly divine? Was death really more honorable than life? One prisoner, a former sergeant from the Philippines campaign, later recalled that he felt ashamed, but awakened. He realized that the enemy he had been taught to hate was not a savage, but a man, and perhaps a freer man than himself. Across the camps, subtle revolutions of the mind unfolded. POWs formed discussion groups. Some wrote poems about the contradictions they felt. Loyalty to a nation that had abandoned them, gratitude toward the enemy who treated them as human. Others volunteered to help American researchers understand Japanese culture, hoping that peace might come sooner. Guards noticed the change, too. The fear in the prisoners' eyes faded. Laughter became normal. The barbed wire no longer seemed like a cage, more like a border between two worlds. By 1945, several thousand Japanese POWs had become symbols of something unexpected: the moral victory of humane treatment over brutality. In letters later declassified by U.S. intelligence, officers reported that the prisoners no longer see the United States as barbaric. They see it as honorable. And yet, this quiet transformation reached its most powerful moment as Japan itself began to crumble. Inside those camps, the prisoners waited, uncertain, conflicted, and forever changed, for news that would end the war and redefine their entire existence. August 15, 1945. The news spread across the camp like wind through dry grass. Japan had surrendered. For hours, there was silence. Men stood motionless, staring at the horizon, as if trying to see across the Pacific to their homeland. For years, they had been told the emperor was divine, the empire eternal. Now both had fallen. The war that had devoured millions was over. Inside the American camps, reactions were complex. Disbelief, relief, grief. Some prisoners wept openly, others prayed, and a few refused to accept the truth. "It cannot be," one whispered, trembling. "Japan does not surrender." Yet the loudspeakers kept repeating it. Emperor Hirohito had spoken. The unthinkable had happened. The American guards watched quietly. They did not gloat or cheer. Many offered silent nods, understanding the gravity of what these men had lost. Not just a nation, but a way of life. In the following weeks, U.S. officers began organizing repatriation efforts. But something unexpected occurred. Many Japanese POWs, when told they would soon be sent home, hesitated. They were afraid. They had learned of the shame awaiting them, that in Japan, captured soldiers were still considered cowards. Families would reject them. Neighbors would shun them. To return meant humiliation. Some requested to stay longer in the camps, to continue working, studying, or helping with reconstruction. A few even applied to emigrate to the United States, hoping to live in the land that had treated them with a kindness they never expected from an enemy. Letters written by these prisoners in the final days of captivity reveal a deep emotional conflict. In this place of defeat, one wrote, "I learned what it means to live as a man, not as a weapon." When they finally boarded ships bound for Japan, the mood was heavy. The barbed wire fences were behind them, but for many, it felt as if they were leaving freedom, not entering it. On the journey home, they carried memories of laughter with guards, of music played in the camp yard, of conversations about democracy and forgiveness. When they arrived in Japan, the reaction was cold. Neighbors turned away. Former officers refused to speak to them. Some were called hikokumen, traitors to the nation. Yet as Japan rebuilt under Allied occupation, these same former POWs became quiet messengers of a new truth. They spoke about what they had seen, that mercy could exist in war, that dignity could survive captivity. Their testimonies contradicted years of propaganda, forcing Japan to confront a painful reality. It was not the Americans who had dehumanized them, but their own system of blind obedience. And in that revelation lay the true turning point. Not the surrender itself, but the awakening of thousands of minds that had learned freedom behind fences. When the war officially ended, the United States found itself responsible for tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war spread across North America, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands. The process of repatriation, returning them to Japan, began under the watch of the War Department and the International Red Cross. By 1946, nearly 130,000 Japanese POWs had passed through American custody. The statistics told a story that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the Pacific battlefield. Less than 1% of Japanese prisoners held in U.S. camps died in captivity, most from illness, not violence. In comparison, tens of thousands of Allied POWs perished in Japanese hands due to starvation, torture, or execution. American officers recorded the process meticulously. Each prisoner was documented, medically examined, and issued supplies for the voyage home. Camps that had once echoed with roll calls and drills now filled with quiet farewells. Guards shook hands with men they had once fought against. Some exchanged addresses, photographs, even gifts, tokens of respect that defied the hatred that had begun the war. For many guards, the experience changed their own perception of the enemy. Letters written by American personnel reveal admiration for the discipline and intelligence of the Japanese prisoners, and astonishment at how swiftly kindness dissolved hostility. One officer wrote, "They came here as enemies and leave as men we understand." The U.S. government regarded the POW program as a success, not just logistically, but morally. American adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929 had been tested under the most extreme emotional circumstances. After Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and countless atrocities. Yet the U.S. had upheld its promise to treat prisoners humanely. There was also a quieter, strategic victory. Through their treatment of Japanese POWs, the Americans demonstrated to the world, and to Japan itself, the moral strength of democracy. Intelligence officers had long understood that compassion could be propaganda's most powerful countermeasure. And it worked. The testimonies of returning POWs began to circulate in post-war Japan, contradicting years of imperial lies. For those prisoners, though, the journey home was painful. Many stepped off the ships at Uraga or Yokohama to find their cities in ruins, their families gone, their emperor's divinity denied, their faith in militarism shattered. They were free again, but freedom now carried the weight of guilt, confusion, and memory. The post-war years in Japan were years of silence. Former prisoners rarely spoke of their captivity, not because it had been cruel, but because it had been too kind. To admit that the enemy had treated them with humanity was to betray the myth that Japan's war had been noble. Society branded them as haisen-sha, defeated men, tainted by surrender. Many returned home only to live in quiet shame, concealing their POW pasts from neighbors, and even from their own children. But in the shadows of this silence, a deeper transformation was taking place. Japan itself was changing. Under American occupation, the nation began dismantling its militaristic ideology and rebuilding as a democracy. The very values that Japanese POWs had first encountered in captivity, individual dignity, free thought, and moral responsibility, were now being woven into the fabric of a new Japan. Some of those former POWs became quiet teachers of that change. A few took part in post-war cultural exchanges with the United States, translating books, teaching English, or working in reconstruction projects. Others wrote memoirs decades later, breaking their silence at last. In their words, gratitude mingled with sorrow. They had seen the best of their enemies and the worst of their own empire, and it had changed them forever. One such account came from Toshio Nishimura, a former Imperial Navy officer captured in the Philippines. In his memoir, he wrote, "The Americans guarded us, but they never humiliated us. In the camps, I learned that strength without compassion is only fear in disguise." Historians later observed that these experiences subtly influenced Japan's pacifist constitution and its post-war moral outlook. The generation that once swore to die for the emperor now raised children who swore never to see war again. Meanwhile, the United States quietly closed its POW facilities. By 1947, nearly all Japanese prisoners had been repatriated. The wooden barracks were dismantled, the barbed wire taken down. Yet in local archives and veterans' letters, the story of those camps survived, not as tales of conflict, but of an unlikely peace. The legacy of America's humane experiment lived on, not in monuments or medals, but in the hearts of men who discovered freedom not on a battlefield, but behind a fence. Decades later, long after the fires of war had cooled, an old man stood in a quiet garden in Kyoto. His hands trembled as he unfolded a faded photograph, a snapshot taken at Camp McCoy in 1945. In it, he and an American guard were smiling, holding a baseball bat between them. On the back, written in neat English, were the words, "No more enemies." He had carried that photo for 40 years. To him, it was proof that even in war, humanity could survive. The story of the Japanese POWs in America is not one of defeat, but awakening. It revealed how an empire built on fear and obedience could be undone by simple acts of decency. A meal shared, a kind word, a lesson in freedom. The barbed wire that once divided enemies became, in time, a bridge between worlds. In the end, the greatest victory was not military, but moral. It was the victory of compassion over vengeance, of dignity over dogma, and for thousands of men who once believed that surrender meant dishonor, it became the beginning of understanding that true strength lies not in dying for a nation, but in learning to live as a human being.